Apostolopoulos and Alec Reid.
I have lived in a junkyard where the weeds eat.
What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of the Big and Tall Sports Podcast. We're mixing things up a little bit this week. We have our guest Stu Lang in studio. Stu, how you doing today?
Good, thanks, Pete.
All right, so we're mixing up the format a little bit today. We're going to talk with Stu today. He's gracious enough to welcome us, can't speak English today. He's been gracious enough to come down to the studio and have a chat with us today in studio. Stu, first of all, I understand you're retired now from the coaching game.
Yes, I'm still involved with the program, though, as Alec knows, as a former quarterback and signal caller for the Great Griffins. I'm involved in building the pavilion, which is something that'll be, in a sense, the best in the CIS. New locker rooms, meeting rooms, and then outside we've got a phenomenal landscaping plan involved to really make coming to the games exciting for our students. So more involved with the program than the day-to-day and the X's and O's.
So for those of you that don't know Stu is very instrumental in the Guelph Griffins football program. We finally got our Yates Cup last year. After 6 years, you were with the program as the head coach.
That's correct.
And 1 year as a receivers coach. Stu, how did the whole process play out? Did it play out exactly like you planned, or was this a little longer than you expected?
I'm really not quite sure. This is going to be a long answer to a short question. I didn't have coaching university football on my bucket list. I'd been retired from our family business, done some coaching with the high school that I attended back in the late 60s, I hate to admit. But through a series of coincidences, I had a chance to meet with Kyle, my predecessor, and I just wanted to help out during training camp. And Kyle, who had just lost his receiver coach, said, well, why don't you come and be a receiver coach? And obviously it was a great opportunity. So I took that. And then the year later, Kyle went off to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and they didn't have a head coach. And I was actually asked, because of my business background, to be on the search committee. And I remember interviewing prospective coaches, even driving once to Buffalo to pick up a U.S. representative to help them get across the border. But about halfway through the interview process, I talked to my wife and I said, would you mind if I threw my hat in the ring? Because I didn't think the university was going in the right direction. And getting to the answer to your question, what excited me was an opportunity to take a struggling football program and try to build it into elite status. And you may get a different answer from my business associates, but I'd always seen myself as a turnaround. In our family business, I was sent to Mexico, I was sent to Leeds, England, I was sent to Grand Rapids, Michigan, just to turn failing business around, businesses that we had just bought, and we wanted to correct some of the problems. So I looked at being a head coach somewhat as a businessman to turn around the football program at Guelph.
So going into your first year as a head coach, how different was it being in that environment, or even as a receivers coach, how different was it being in that environment as a coach as opposed to when you were a player, whether it be in college or when you played pro? How different is the mentality that you had when talking to players, when coming up with schemes, protections, whatnot? How different is that from the other side of the sideline?
Oh, a big difference, and you don't really get to understand that until you're in the shoes. As a football player, you always thought you had the tough end of the stick, and then all of a sudden you become a coach and realize you're working 24 hours a day to get people ready. And then going from a positional coach where you're hands-on, you're actually teaching skills, you're helping a player to get better, then all of a sudden you become a head coach. And I remember the first time sitting on the sideline saying, I can't do anything. The players have been prepared during the week. The positional coaches, my offensive and defensive coordinator calling signals. I almost felt like a statue on the sidelines. Like, well, what am I supposed to do? So I got pretty good at yelling at referees. But no, so it's a big difference as you move up the ladder from player to positional coach to head coach.
So Stu, for those of you that don't know, has been successful in absolutely everything. Started at Queen's University, played his football there, then was drafted to the Edmonton Eskimos, where he won 5 Grey Cups in 7 seasons?
8 years.
8 years. 8 years. Won 5 Grey Cups, then took over his family business, CCL, and eventually came to the Griffins. So let's just talk about getting drafted, going to the CFL. It's an experience that an absolute minority of people get to actually experience. So what is that like? What is it like playing professional football?
It was amazing. We're all kids, even though we're 20s, 30 years old, and you're getting paid for something you enjoy. So it was an amazing experience, and I don't take any credit for it. Again, apologize for a long answer here, but. As you would know, so my first 2 years at Queens, I was a receiver. And then because of injuries and lack of recruiting running backs, they moved me to running back the last 2 years. And it's actually a position I did play in high school for a couple of years. And as you know, Alec, generally speaking, when it comes to draft, they don't draft Canadian running backs. It's basically an American position outside of maybe Canadian fullback. But even that position is not being used as much in today's CFL. So I got drafted in 1974 in the 7th round, which I think was the last round, by Edmonton. And so I went to Edmonton, and I'll tell you some of the experiences there. But about halfway through the first year, Frank Morris, who was the Canadian scout, and the fellow who drafted me, I bumped into him at a restaurant, and he said, "Why don't you join me at my table?" So I sat down. I was having dinner with him, and one of his first questions was, "Stu, do you know why we drafted you?" And I said, "Frank, honestly, I don't know why you drafted me." And he said, "It was because of the first 2 years when we were scouting you." And that says a lot about the Edmonton Eskimos, scouting me in year 1 and year 2 and keeping the records. So I go to Edmonton in 1974, and so many things happened. It was the year of the players' strike. So for all of training camp, the veterans didn't show up. It was just the rookies. So we had 2 weeks of showcasing our talent without the veterans being there. And then finally, when the veterans came back, the players that were ahead of me all got injured. So I just ended up at the front of the line and ended up starting my first year. It was unbelievable. And from then on, as you mentioned, played 8 years, went in the Grey Cup 7 times, won 5 times. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience.
So Stu did enjoy a very successful career, capped off by the 1978 season where he had 48 catches for 618 yards and 4 touchdowns in 16 games. So when did you decide that it was enough and enough was enough? When did that moment hit? I know that's something that not a lot of athletes want to talk about when you had to call it quits, but eventually everyone has to. So when did that moment come for you?
Good question. So when I arrived in 1974, all the fans talked about the Eskimos of the 50s, the Jackie Parker days, and they won 3 Grey Cups in a row. And since that time, Edmonton has struggled as a football team, ending up in last place several years and just never having a good enough team to do anything. And then all of a sudden, things started to come together, and we started. I won 1 Grey Cup in 75, which was the first Grey Cup they'd won in many years. But then in 78, I think it was 78, 79, 88, 78, they started winning Grey Cups. And so there's 78, there was 79, there was 80 and 81. And I guess the way I looked at it is I wanted to do something that no other CFL team had done, which was to win 4 Grey Cups in a row and have one more than the Eskimos of the 50s. So when we won the 4th one in 81, I decided to retire. We were not living in Edmonton at the time. We were living in Toronto. My wife was from Ottawa. So we decided that it was probably a good time to buy a home, live in Toronto. And I was fortunate enough in that with the family business, I always had something to fall back on. So I decided to retire in 81, maybe a year too soon because they also won in 82, which was their 5th year. But at least I was there for the 4 of the 5 in a row.
So Stu, with your experiences playing, how difficult was that transition to go from the CIS to professional? You know, we hear it all the time from different athletes talk about that transition, whether it be in basketball, football, baseball, etc., hockey. But from someone who's done it, how difficult is that transition?
Pete, good question. Actually, I was going to answer it incorrectly, so I'm glad you asked it a second time. Thanks. I tell all the recruits, as Alec would know, that the biggest jump for a player is actually from high school to university, not necessarily university to pro. University, in a sense, is almost more professional than the pro leagues. And I say that from the fact that they basically practice 12 months a year. And they have all these commitments on top of their school commitments, which is tough. So it's a big jump. Generally, from high school to university, you've been playing with players somewhat your same age. Then all of a sudden you get to university. Now you're playing with players that could be 5 or 6 years older. They're more mature. They're stronger. They're faster. The game is much faster. The plays are more complicated, so it's a big jump. I found the jump from university to pro not as difficult. Probably what players talk about most is your season doubles in length. At university, you play 8 games. Now you're playing 16 plus playoffs, so that gets really tough on the body. So that's probably the biggest jump from university to professional. But the biggest jump mentally and physically and emotionally is from high school to university.
You just touched on how you're going from an environment where you're playing with your buddies in high school for the most part. I mean, if you grow up, you play junior football and then senior. And then now you're going into an atmosphere where you're playing with guys who are 4 or 5 years older than you. And the same thing probably happened to you when you played pro as well in Edmonton. Do you think that going off the field, do you think that that level of maturity or that level of team atmosphere needs to be there? And is it a different dynamic when you're going from playing with guys who are your own age or closer to your own age in high school and college, and then going to pro where there could be guys who are, you could be 20 and there could be another receiver who's 35, right?
Well, exactly. Now, I was a little more fortunate than today's athlete because when I played at Queens, you could play football as long as you were in school. So we had some guys that were playing in their 8th and 9th year. And Joe Powell, who is my roommate and still one of my closest friends, we always joke about our first post-game party showing up, and some of the players had their kids with them. So that was a big change.
So you talk about the locker room differences, definitely from obviously high school to university to the professional level. But we're witnessing now in the NFL especially, there's so much going wrong off the field. And maybe from your experiences, not only as a player but as a coach, are these issues with the game or issues with the players, or do you think that it's a societal issue, or maybe it's just the way that the NFL is handling the league right now?
Yeah, another great question. I don't think there are any easy answers, but from my experience, I can try to answer it, and I think it's a multiple number of things. I do think the problem resides ultimately with the player, because everyone has a personal choice to do it or not to do it. But as a coach, I think it's my responsibility, and especially at university where it's not professional. This is not the only thing they do. In fact, it's not the most important thing. They're at university to grow as young men, intellectually, physically, emotionally, spiritually, all those things. So I often referred to the football field as the second classroom. You have your traditional classroom, which is in bricks and mortars, but there's the second classroom, which I would argue is even more important because it teaches about the values of life, which is the football field or the ice rink, wherever it is. So it was my responsibility, I felt, to help educate our players about a holistic approach to life. And as Alec would know, we brought in a number of different speakers to speak on topics that we thought were relevant. The other thing I think is, and certainly in my era, things have changed. I hate to admit it, but when I grew up, the internet wasn't there, social media. So a lot of this, rightly or wrongly, I think causes or forces athletes of today to brand themselves. It's really important for them, especially in the NFL, somewhat to an extent in the CFL, but in the NFL, you can make a lot of money being a unique figure or character. So unfortunately, the team first attitude somewhat gets forgotten, and people are more interested in themselves. So they're out trying to communicate and brand themselves, and to do that, they have to be different. And it goes back to that old expression, sometimes negative publicity is good. So in order for them to be different, they try to do things that, may not be in the best interests of themselves, their football team, whatever. But I think that's one of the causes. Social media is just a big thing today.
And with that, as you touched on, as a coach, you're trying to prepare your players and keep them with as many tools as they can have to succeed, whether it be in the classroom or on the field. For a professional coach and being in a locker room like that, is that onus still on the players, or do you think that a lot of the issues we're seeing in the NFL, with whether it be guys getting arrested or getting into fights at bars, do you think that comes from a lack of veteran leadership communicating with the coaching staff and the rest of the organization about going back to what kind of brand do they want to set? Or do you think that that's just the players being not very smart people?
Well, I think that's one of the answers. I'm a Dallas Cowboy fan back to the 1960s with Roger Staubach. But one of the teams I've been following in the last decade is the New England Patriots. And I just like how they do things. And they often talk about the Patriot way, and you better follow this way or you're not going to be part of the team. And I think a lot of professional teams need to follow that example, and to say, who are we? What do we represent? Because certainly we want to win football games, but we also represent the community that we're in. Talk about the Chicago Cubs last night. They were so tied up in the city of Chicago. So it's important that as a player you respect that. So getting back to your answer about the captains, I do think, obviously it's a coach's ultimate responsibility, but he has to choose and train his captains to be his sort of eyes and ears and mouth when he's not there. And as Alec knows, I often talk to the captains, and the players, I said, listen, when you're at a party, I'm not going to be there, but I'm going to be there in spirit, and my spirit's represented by the captains. And if they come up to you and say, hey, you've had enough to drink, or this is not the way the Griffin acts, you better understand that as words coming from me. So I think it's really important that captains live the way that you've presented as a football team. Just as an aside, big fan of Urban Meyer, talks greatly about Tim Tebow and how Tim Tebow handled that locker room and made sure everyone sort of followed the Gator line. So I think it's important that you choose good captains, absolutely.
And for those of you who were unfortunate enough not to have Stu as a coach, it is through and through exactly like he says. And Stu did a great job bringing in, I remember Doug Flug coming in and speaking with us about stuff like this. We had social media training, we had sexual assault training, all this stuff that might not be going on in a lot of different atmospheres and a lot of different environments. And Stu has just been so groundbreaking in what he's brought in the OUA. So for those of you that didn't get a chance to have Stu as a coach, I honestly kind of feel sorry for you. So, but coming back on that, do you think that this is, you hear about all these issues and you never really hear about as serious of an issue in other sports? Like we don't hear about this stuff happening maybe in baseball, hockey, the one I can think of is like Patrick Kane and stuff like that. But we don't hear about these kind of things happening all the time as much as we do in football. Is that maybe because there's more players or there's more teams, or is it just the sport in general?
I don't think there's always simple answers to difficult questions. And I think you've touched on a number of them. The NFL is the sport in the U.S., and it gets a lot of coverage. So every little thing that happens is in the public eye. So I think there's an element of that. The other thing is, and you touched on it too, is the nature of the game. And I've often told people that as a coach, you're looking for violent people, because football is a violent game. when I was with the Edmonton Eskimos, they often referred to it as a street fight that just keeps moving around the field. And I don't mean you want to injure people, but it is a very physical game. And generally the winner is the person that beats the other team physically and mentally. So you're looking for these violent people. And, John Rush, we all know John Rush, just an amazing physical player. But on the other hand, you want the players to realize once they step over that white line and they cease playing football, they have to be gentlemen. And to find that combination of violence and gentleness is not always easy.
So John Rush played linebacker for Guelph for 5 years. He won the President's Trophy for the CIS Defensive Player of the Year, first ever Griffin.
Yes.
And the first Griffin since Mike O'Shea to win the President's Trophy for the OUA. I think he had 11 tackles in the Yates Cup.
Oh, he was just unbelievable.
3 sacks. He's a phenomenal player. So, John, if you're listening, wish you nothing but the best. Hopefully you can get back to the CFL. I'm looking forward to it.
He just got signed, I believe, from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. I haven't heard much since that news, so good for him.
So, again, like you just talked about, we have to have the right people in place to convey that message to the players. So what makes a good captain? Like, who's somebody that you would go, like, is it something that just happens where you go, I think that guy's going to be my captain one day when you're recruiting? Or is it something that you see in guys as you see them progress into seniors and older players on the team? What really are some of the things that you look for in guys?
Good question. Just as an aside, one of the things the University of Guelph is doing, which I think is a great idea, it's something that was modeled, I believe, in North Carolina, where they identify people in first year and they put them through a leadership course in hopes of, by the time they get to their 4th or 5th year, when they get to the opportunity to be captains, to be ready. Because unfortunately, in my era, it was typically the best player. The best player became the captain, and that's not necessarily the right way to choose a captain. So what do you look for? Obviously, when we recruit people, we talk a lot to the head football coach or the positional coach in high school and get a sense of, okay, what did he do off the field? Was he the first guy to show up for workouts in the summer? Did he make all the meetings? Does he watch tape? Is he a guy that people would follow into battle with? So those are all the things we look for in a leader. Is he at least has the attitude of wanting to be the best in everything? He may not be the fastest player or the strongest player, but he's always in the weight room lifting weights. He's always out doing sprint training. And a sense that when he talks, people listen. So those are the major things that I look for in a captain.
So, Stu, and I've touched on this, of how groundbreaking you've been with the Griffin program. Just talk about where the Griffin program goes from here. I know you're still in an advisory role, almost an ambassador, bringing in the new $6.5 million pavilion, and just so many things that no other program in the country is doing. Can you just touch, where does the Griffin football program go from here?
Well, that's a good question. We're always thinking about how to become better. Obviously, Laval is the gold standard judging from championships, and they have some advantages being in Quebec that we don't in Ontario, but the fact is we have to compete against Laval. So we're still struggling and trying to get to the level where we can play football as well as Laval can. But everything revolves around recruiting. It's not the smartest coaches that win, it's the coaches with the best players. So it's important that you're out recruiting the best players. So you have to create an attractive program for the high school student and also for the parent, because the parents will tell you it's their son's decision, but I think they have a lot involved in the decision in terms of, is it a good school? I don't care if my son necessarily wins a championship, but he better come out a better man. So we want to make sure we're attractive not just to the player, but also the parents. So therefore, we try to build a program and not necessarily a team. A team is part of the program, but a program is more. So we're trying to take this holistic approach where we can provide opportunities off the field, such as community service, study hall, tutors, those types of things, which we do, and they can always get better. But now we're looking at training the players better. So the new pavilion that you mentioned has a better locker room, and the design of the locker room, as we looked at some of the NCAA models, was not a traditional big room, which I was more familiar with, but they had these alcoves, locker rooms within locker rooms. So the little locker room of an alcove would be for the offensive line. So the O-line coach can literally sit in this mini locker within the bigger locker and talk about preparation for practice or for the game. Obviously, we're now going to have meeting rooms on the second floor, so that rather than having to run off and try to find classrooms, the players now can go from the first floor to their own room. So we'll have an offensive line room, a defensive line room for all the positions. So we want to get into training our players better. And the other thing, which is probably the biggest focus, is we're trying to create a more professional game day event. I think that's the next big step for us, is because everyone wants to play in front of a large crowd. It's pretty exciting. And Alec, as you know, we tend to do well during O Week and homecoming, but the other games tend to just fall off. So the pavilion, the landscaping, and some of the ideas we have in terms of the kids zone, improving the tailgate area. Even got some suggestions the other day, because we're a vet school, having a dog park where you can bring your dog to the game and watch the game. So a lot of my focus in the next step is the game day event. How can we make it exciting? How can we not just get the students to come, but also the community to get involved?
Well, Stu, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to wrap it up on that. We're going to take a quick break. Be sure to join us for the second half of the podcast here on the Big and Tall Sports Podcast. Stu, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Alec. Thanks, Pete.
That's in the air to center. Back at the wall. It is gone. What a start. Dexter Fowler, hello in Game 7. 1-0 Chicago. High fly ball into left. What's it going to be? Bryant tags. Davis catches. Here comes Bryant. Throw to the plate. High. Safe. Under the tag, and the Cubs lead 2-1. High fly ball into right center. Davis came in, goes back, won't get there off the wall. In to score is Zobrist, and the lead is 2. It's 3-1. Ross flies one into center, sends Davis back at the wall, and it is gone. The 39-year-old in his final game, David Ross, has made it 6-3. 2 out. Drive into left. At the wall. It's gone. Tie game. Rajay Davis. 6-6. Zobrist. That's a base hit. Cubs will take the lead. Almora digging to the plate. Zobrist delivers 7-6 in the 10th. 1. This is going to be a tough play. Bryant, the Cubs win the World Series. Bryant makes the play. It's over. And the Cubs have finally won it all. 8-7 and 10.
catch it, the selector pull it up and put it for repeat, girl. Me not touch a dollar in my pocket, 'cause nothing in this world ain't more than what you worth.
All right, and we're back from our break here on the Big and Tall Sports Pod, episode 2. We just had a fantastic conversation with Alec's former Guelph Griffins head football coach, Stu Lang. So now I guess we'll get to our portion of the podcast and kind of do our introductions and our regular routine. So Alec, what episode we got here?
Episode number 2, so I think it's only fitting that we go to New York and the captain, Derek Jeter.
Base hit to right field. Here comes Richardson. Here's the throw from Markakis. Richardson is safe. Derek Jeter ends his final game with a walk-off single. Derek Jeter.
Hit toward the hole. Jeter backhands from the outfield grass. Got him! Man, what a play.
That is fair down the right field line. Giambi on his way to third, and they're going to wave him around. The throw misses a cutoff man. Shot into the plate. Out of the plate. Derek Jeter with one of the most unbelievable plays you will ever see by a shortstop.
Derek Jeter, arguably one of the greatest Yankees of all time, and for sure the best number 2 in sports history. And Pete, any thoughts on Derek Jeter?
Derek Jeter, unfortunately, played for the New York Yankees, who absolutely destroyed the Toronto Blue Jays. And, you know, a lot of people talk about rivalries in sports and how you're not supposed to like guys on the teams that kick the crap out of your team, but it's hard to it's hard to argue against guys like Derek Jeter. I mean, the guy was an absolute legend, 14-time All-Star, 3-time World Series, 5-time World Series champ, correct?
Yep, 5-time World Series champ. Won the World Series MVP in 2000, AL Rookie of the Year, 5-time Gold Glover, 5-time Silver Slugger, 2-time Hank Aaron Award winner, and the Yankees captain for 11 years. Also the man I modeled my swing after.
We all know where that got you. So it's recording this on a Thursday, and I don't know if anybody noticed yesterday, but there was a pretty important baseball game. Alec?
That was the greatest baseball game I have ever seen. That, not to mention the fact that it was the first time the Cubs won the World Series in 108 years. But that baseball game was the greatest game I have ever watched. And it is a phenomenal time for baseball. Thank you to the Cubs and the Indians for just an incredible baseball game.
I mean, we talked about yesterday, we were supposed to record the podcast yesterday. Thank God we didn't, and we did it today because, you know, we're looking at our notes, and one of the big things we talked about when we were planning for the episode was if we talk about Game 7, we got to talk about how important Corey Kluber and Andrew Miller are going to be, because if Corey Kluber and Andrew Miller pitch like they've been pitching, look out Chicago Cubs, and that curse was going to keep going. But the Cubs, you know, Dexter Fowler leadoff home run, barely gets over the fence. I thought Rajai Davis caught it. I don't know about you.
Yeah, the way he came down, it looked like he caught it. I mean, we talked about this in the first episode of the podcast, was the Cubs had the ability to just strike at any time. They had power all through the lineup, and coming off of being down 3-1, did anyone really believe the series was over?
I mean, you can't count that team out. They were wire to wire. A lot of people picked them, if not everybody picked them to win in August or April, excuse me. But I mean, looking at the way they're constructed, again, they took great approaches. They got to Andrew Miller. Andrew Miller and Corey Kluber, Aroldis Chapman, all three of those guys looked absolutely gassed yesterday.
Well, how bad of a decision would it have been if they had have lost by Joe Madden to put Aroldis Chapman in when they're up 7-2 in Game 6?
We were texting back and forth during the game, and I said it a few times to you that Joe Madden really had an atrocious game yesterday. And if they lose that game, I think that he would wear a lot of the blame.
Well, he should. You look at some of the decisions he made. Taking out Kyle Hendricks, I thought he had 7 innings in him. Putting in John Lester instead, and then a couple of errors, just a miscommunication. Leaving Chapman in, or putting Chapman in instead of Lester. That bunt on a 3-2 count with Rizzo at the plate. Baez at the plate. Come on. The guy was the NLCS co-MVP. Sure, he doesn't hit great against lefties, but give the kid a chance. He's a phenomenal hitter, and it just, everything felt like they didn't want to win that game.
Yeah, and, you know, a lot of times in sports we talk about these fantastic performances and these big games, but the reality of the matter is that these guys have played a lot of baseball, right? They've played a ton of baseball. And my dad even texted me going into extra innings. He goes, this isn't going to be pretty the way this game ended. And I think it ended a lot differently than a lot of people thought it was going to in extra innings, with the Cubs getting a pile of runs.
And I think that boils down to just the Cubs' patience. And you look at guys like Kyle Schwarber and what he brought back to the lineup, and Chris Bryant finally finding his stride. Anthony Rizzo obviously had a great game on both sides of the ball. But I think that what this boils down to is just a phenomenal baseball team playing a phenomenal game, and a guy who we counted out, Jason Hayward, maybe rallying the team together at that rain delay. Did you hear about that, Pete?
Yeah, I was actually having a conversation this morning with somebody about that. And, you know, we were talking again during the game, like, this guy's going up and he's had the same – I saw a bunch of stuff on Twitter about it too. He's going up with the same approach. They've been getting him out pretty much the whole season on throwing him inside fastballs off the plate. And I believe he was hitting 30 or 40 points lower than the league average on fastballs in the regular season. And you know what? The guy went 0 for 4, but they gave him a pile of money, and he may not have earned it on the field. But I think when a guy shows that much character and rallies the troops, and he's not an old guy by any means. He's, you know, in his mid-20s. So I think, you know, hopefully he can figure his swing out a little bit and can contribute more on the field. But, I mean, without that rain delay, I think the Cleveland Indians are the World Series champions.
I agree 100%. And the thing that got me about this game was it was just an absolute emotional roller coaster. And I'm sitting there, and it was when Rajai Davis is at the plate, and I'm sitting there talking with my girlfriend, and she's like, he's going to hit a home run here. And I'm like, there's no way. It's Rajai Davis. He's not hitting a home run here. I could see him choking up on the bat. I'm like, there's no way. Gone. And I look at her, and I'm like, are you kidding me? You just jinxed this. Like, do you want the Cubs to win? Are you kidding me? And then you and I, we were texting back and forth. And when, what's his name? When Ben Zobrist, when Ben Zobrist stepped up to the plate, and we literally text each other at the same time saying, single to left, single opposite field. And then it happens, and it's like Anthony Rizzo's face standing on third base described how everyone was feeling.
Did you see the video of him mic'd up during the game when he was talking with Ross and I think it was Amaro Jr., and they're on the bench, and he's like, Rossi, like, I don't know what's going on. Like, I can't, like, think straight right now. Like, he was absolutely freaking out.
He was in a glass case of emotion.
He was in a glass case of emotion. But I think another important factor in the game was the Cubs really had the appropriate approach, and they had the right guys up in the right times. You know, Zobrist. You could tell when he stepped in the box, he's looking to hit that ball the other way through that hole in the left side, you know? Even Miguel Montero with the pinch hit. You know, we saw him hit a pinch hit home run earlier in the playoffs, and again, delivers wonderful approach right through the left side. And again, going back to Amaro Jr., who got into the game, if he doesn't take that extra base on Rajai Davis, that game probably doesn't go to where it goes.
That is, like, we talked about smart base running all year from the Cleveland Indians and how good of a base running team they were. Rajai Davis, you said, led the league in steals. You said that to me earlier, but that honestly was the difference maker. I think Chris Bryant, again, with that great slide, getting under the tag. Rajai Davis got exposed on two separate occasions on fly balls. And Chris Bryant, again, the stat track running 20 miles an hour, going first to third on that stolen, I guess it was 3-2 count, goes first to third and then rounds the bag and scores. Like, we talked how great of a base running team the Indians were, especially when they were playing the Blue Jays. But that was great base running and great small ball from the power hitting Chicago Cubs.
And you also look at, we're just looking at my Twitter timeline right now from last night, looking over at some of the notes that we were making to ourselves last night watching the game. But how about Anthony Rizzo, lefty on lefty against Miller, getting that huge double down the line? You know, again, the big guys showed up for the Cubs, and how often did we hear Mike Napoli's name last night? Francisco Lindor. You know, the Indians guys didn't show up like the Cubs guys did. And John Lester absolutely dominated when he was throwing yesterday, and he deserved to win that game in regular play, because the Cubs handed that game back to the Indians with all the errors.
So we're gonna end our baseball talk right there. We are gonna talk football today, as we had Stu Lang on earlier in the podcast. But God, if you're a Cubs fan, congratulations to the city of Chicago. I mean, I was an emotional roller coaster, and I've heard so many great stories about guys, you know, paying tribute to their parents. 81-year-old man I saw was so excited. He was crying after the game, and heard a great story about a man who took a radio to his father's grave because he said that he was going to watch the World Series when the Cubs finally won one. They were going to watch one together. So it's a fantastic story. He sat there with his radio and listened to the game with his dad. So baseball and sports in general can really bring people together, and a lot of great stories like that. So
big shout out to Grandpa Rossi.
Grandpa Rossi, was he 39 years old, hitting a bomb, just incredible. And I love his tweet. The boys got me a great retirement gift with a picture of him holding the World Series trophy.
One last note is before we move on to football, is Theo Epstein the best executive in the history of sports? Because he ended an 86-year curse and an 108-year curse in the same decade.
What I love with Epstein is he told the Cubs fans 5 years ago, I got a plan, stick with me, I got a plan. And look what happened. So I think you're right. I think he should go down as the greatest executive to not stop not one, but two of the greatest curses in sports history. So Pete, let's talk football. Great conversation with Stu Lang. Stu, thank you so much for joining us again. Stu is so knowledgeable about so many different things in football, but we want to talk NFL right now and what is going on in the league. Back-to-back weeks, we have a tie. That's a joke.
So we've thrown this around planning for the podcast, and I think we're both in agreement that you're an offensive-driven league, right? Nobody's watching the games to watch a 10-6 field goal fest with really good defense and lots of punts. We want to watch the Atlanta Falcons and Matt Ryan give up the most points but score the most points, right? I believe they're first in points scored and 29th points against.
They're also number one in yards per game with 425 yards per game.
We want to watch that. So why don't we take our superstar quarterbacks, put them on the 35-yard line like they do in the NCAA, and let them throw it into the end zone back and forth until somebody stops them.
Yeah, and NCAA and CFL rules are just like that. Let's start at the 35. You got to better or match them. And how many sports do we see a tie, right? How many professional sports do we see a tie? CFL doesn't do it. The NHL controversially went to a shootout, but how exciting are shootouts, right? Remember that game. It was the Islanders had to make the playoffs in the last game of the season, and the game came down to a shootout. That was the most exciting game 82 we've ever seen. And sure, the shootout, you can call it gimmicky or say what you want about it, but it is so important, and it's another aspect of the game that teams have to prepare for. So I agree. Basketball doesn't end in ties. Baseball doesn't end in ties. Soccer, I understand. You know, in a 1-0 game, I understand it not ending in a tie. And shootouts, going to penalty kicks, can be very controversial. But so many other leagues in football have adopted different overtime rules so that we don't end in ties. And the NCAA, every playoff game or every overtime game, is exciting.
Yeah, no doubt. And again, it goes back to who do you want people to watch, right? Your quarterbacks. Who are the superstars in the NFL? Tom Brady, Cam Newton, Russell Wilson, Ben Roethlisberger, Aaron Rodgers, Andrew Luck, Derek Carr now with the Oakland 6-2, right?
Derek Carr is a stud.
You want to watch the quarterbacks. Those are everybody's sweethearts, everybody's favorite player. All our rules revolve around protecting the quarterback and giving them time to throw the ball down the field and you're not allowed to touch the receivers, and you're not allowed to do anything to mess with the offensive side of the ball, basically.
Speaking of protecting the quarterbacks, what do you think about Cam Newton, and did you hear the response that he got from Roger Goodell?
I didn't hear the response, but I will say really quick that I don't agree with Cam Newton, because we've talked about this before, and we'll talk about it now on the pod, getting into it more, but the guy doesn't know how to slide properly. So how can you go and blame the referees or the league or anyone else saying that you're not getting enough calls, or you're not doing this, or you're not doing that, when the player does not know how to protect himself properly? And on top of that, I saw a stat that ESPN tweeted yesterday that Cam Newton has actually gotten the most roughing the passer calls since he's been in the NFL. So I'm a little puzzled by how he can come out and say, the NFL needs to do a better job protecting me. And contrary to that, we heard a couple of Steelers players come out and say it too, and we've heard a couple other people around the league. Ben Roethlisberger probably takes the most shots out of any quarterback. Andrew Luck takes a lot of shots. Russell Wilson takes a lot of shots, right? Cam Newton runs the ball a lot and doesn't know how to slide properly. Go out in the field like we did when we were 10 years old after a day that it rains and learn how to slide. You know what I mean? Like, it's ridiculous.
So Cam Newton went to the league, complained about these late and dangerous hits that he was taking. And the NFL did admit they missed a few calls. And apparently they had a very good conversation with Cam about the rules, and did say, yes, the officials did miss those calls. However, with all that being said, you're right. Cam Newton holds himself to this superstar caliber.
Which is deserved.
Absolutely deserved. But it comes back to guys like him and Odell Beckham, and all you hear about is them complaining. And I get it. Safety is a thing, and player safety should be the number one priority. However, guys got to learn how to protect themselves first. Learn how to get rid of the ball. Learn how to slide. Learn how to get out of bounds. Protect yourself first. Then the league will protect you. And don't complain about the league, and then let the league protect you.
And another thing, too, is you're a quarterback. You're a big guy. You're probably around the same size as Cam Newton is.
Yeah, he's got like 40 pounds on me, though.
Yeah, well, that's why he's in the NFL and you're sitting in here with me. But if you look at the way the game is played and how there really isn't a lot of, like we said, there's not a lot of calls that go against the offense, right? You can't touch the receivers anymore. Everything that, if you breathe on the quarterback or the kicker or the punter after the play's done, you're going to get flagged for it, right? So it's really tough to sympathize with a guy like this. Plus, what happens if this is not Cam Newton coming out and complaining about it? What if it's Geno Smith or Tyrod Taylor or Blake
Russell
Bortles?
Wilson? I think Russell Wilson has more of a right to complain than anybody, but I'll say this jokingly. He shouldn't be complaining to the league. He should be complaining to his coach, because his offensive line is terrible. But you're right. If this is another guy who didn't sit and refused to do his interview after he lost and talk about how he's a sore loser and didn't show up looking like a goon to every interview, I think this comes across a lot stronger. But let's talk about the NFC West in Seattle and Arizona. We talked about this tie. How does this tie impact the NFC West, and who wins the division in, let's be honest, the worst division in football right now?
Yeah, worst division in football right now. And if somebody said that to you before the season started, you would tell them, I don't know about that. Look, you have the Rams in Los Angeles, and they don't have a superstar player right now. They have their number one draft pick, first overall, sitting on the bench, which I totally agree with. So I'm okay with Jeff Fisher saying, hey, kids, sit down. And they've been a pretty up-and-down team this year.
But that's what they've always been. They've been a strong defensive team with a lot of heart, but not a lot of superstars. And this is what we're seeing nowadays in the league, is how many teams actually have superstars anymore.
Right. And if you look at Arizona and Seattle, Seattle has Wilson. They have Cam Chancellor. They have
Richard Sherman,
Earl Thomas, right? And if you look at Arizona, you have Patrick Peterson, Carson Palmer, David Johnson, Larry Fitzgerald, right? You have weapons all over the field. Both teams do. But it seems that no matter how many weapons those two teams have, 1 week the offense will go score a ton of points for Arizona, and the next week they'll go throw up 7, right? And you have arguably one of the best defensive backs in football, and you're getting torched by Cam Newton and the 1-5 Carolina Panthers. Like, that can't happen for a team that's expected to go to the Super Bowl.
No, not at all. I think the main problem is you have a lot of teams that are built around these great defenses. And maybe this is a problem with the NFL right now and why the ratings are so bad is everyone looked at Denver and they looked at Seattle, these teams that have won championships built off of the backs of their defenses, and thought, hey, let's build our defenses up. Well, now offenses are struggling. The NFL is struggling. The NFL is a terrible game to watch right now. I mean, that maybe the 6-6 game that Seattle and Arizona had, the overtime was fantastic. You're on the edge of your seat, and then it ended, and it was terrible. All the London games, I'll say, have been pretty good. The Thursday night games are horrible. And I'm a Denver fan. Watching that Denver and San Diego game on Thursday night was a joke. Trevor Siemian looked just awful. The entire Broncos team offensively looked awful. Phillip Rivers looked awful. And I'll relay that into the AFC West, which honestly is the best division of football right now. And I'll ask you this. Can 3 teams in one division make the playoffs?
You have to look at it like this. Alex Smith getting hurt. Huge.
So, update on Alex Smith, and we heard about this. I just heard about this today. Out for this week, questionable going forward.
Okay, so Alex Smith is out this week. Ben Roethlisberger possibly back Sunday. If not this week, next week. So Pittsburgh's going to be back in it. You look at Oakland, and they might have the most electric offense in the league right now. Derek Carr can't do any wrong right now. And he's got Amari Cooper and Crabtree, and the running backs, Latavius Murray's got a ton of touchdowns. And their offense has been fantastic all year, and they're a fun, young team to watch. I would almost put them in the kind of the Chicago Cubs of football, so to speak. They have a lot of young talent, and, you know, they might make it into the playoffs this year and get smoked their first game.
You hit the nail right on the head, though. They're a fun team to watch, and that's what's awesome about Oakland. And being a Denver fan, it's tough to admit, but I love watching Oakland play. And a big game this week coming up, both teams 6-2, Denver and Oakland heading in this Sunday. That's going to be a great game. You have the best defense in the NFL, bar none. Von Miller is a freak, and what I love about Von Miller is he makes teams scheme around him, which frees everyone else up. So teams are now double blocking Miller, which is leaving DeMarcus Ware one-on-one. Brandon Marshall is getting all this space to stop the run and make tackles. Akeem Talib, Chris Harris, these guys are just being able to play one-on-one, play man-to-man because they get so much pressure on the quarterback in a variety of different ways. I think this could be the game of the year. If Denver's offense is doing enough, getting the ball to the right players, with C.J. Anderson out, obviously that's going to hurt them. Devontae Booker will be okay, but I think getting the ball, moving the ball around to Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, getting Booker involved in the pass game will be big. But I think this will be the best game of the year. Agree or disagree?
It's definitely a possibility, but I mean, we all thought that Arizona-Seattle game was going to be the game of the year, and that was 6-6. So, I mean, this season has been so wacky in the NFL, and there have been so many distractions from the actual play, which hasn't been great, right? And when it comes down to it, you could talk about all the stuff off the field. You can talk about Goodell. You could talk about the teams. But if the product isn't good, the product isn't good, right? You can't help the fact that Nick Saban and Alabama are rolling over everybody and they're scoring a ton of points. And, you know, you have Clemson scoring a bunch of touchdowns. And, you know, those NCAA games are fun to watch, every single one of them, right?
Now, this is just a suggestion. Is the CFL, and we talked with Stu Lang, who played in the CFL for 8 years, won 5 Grey Cups. Is the CFL a more fun game to watch than the NFL? I'm going to say yes. 3 downs, wider field. Every kick has to be returned with the rouges and the no yards rule, which if you guys don't know, no yards is you have to give 5 yards on every kick return or punt every time the ball's kicked. So what I love about that is the game is exciting. It's a pass-first league, which is what the NFL clearly wanted to be a few years ago. 20-second play clock keeps the game quick, and I love it. I think it's awesome to watch. Pete, do you agree or disagree?
I think that the CFL has done an excellent job of tailoring their game to make it different in the same concept. So football as a concept, everyone throw the ball down the field, run the ball, make tackles, kick field goals, all that stuff. But the way that the CFL uses rules like the Rouge, you have to return the kicks every time. They create ways for big, exciting plays to happen. And in the NFL, if you have a running back who runs for 4 yards a carry and just pounds it up the middle every time, that's great. You're going to probably win a lot of games if you have a good offensive line and you can do what the team like the Dallas Cowboys doing. But we don't want to see that. We want to see guys throw it 50 yards down the field and throw bombs like Ben Roethlisberger does to Antonio Brown every week. Antonio Brown.
Really quick, you mentioned the Dallas Cowboys. Dak Prescott or Tony Romo?
Dak. And we're going to get into this now because I know you disagree with me.
100% disagree with you.
But how can you go against the kid? Dak has done everything you've asked him to do. He's held on to the ball. He hasn't made mistakes. And really, it doesn't matter who's playing because they're just going to be handing the ball off to Zeke every time anyways. They have the 7th most points per game in the NFL, and they have the 7th fewest opponent points per game. So they're basically scoring top 10, and they're defending top 10 right now. And they're finding ways to win games, right? If Tony Romo comes back, you don't know what you're getting out of Tony Romo. You can say...
Whoa. I 100% disagree with that. You know exactly what you're getting out of Tony Romo. I don't know if you know what you're getting out of him health-wise. His health might be a question, but you know exactly what you're getting out of Tony Romo. You're getting a guy who I believe is 7th all-time in touchdown to interception ratio. That is phenomenal. And people are going to talk about Tony and how he choked in the playoffs. And Tony Romo has led a team that has been god-awful in a number of years to the playoffs consistently. He has found ways to make plays in big situations, lead fourth quarter drives with teams that may or may not have been that good. We don't know because without Tony Romo, we might not have known. This is a team led by Dak Prescott, and I love what Dak Prescott is doing, but you're telling me that Tony Romo couldn't do better? Sure, Dak Prescott is bringing a different atmosphere, but you just mentioned it before. We want to see Ben Roethlisberger throw the ball downfield to Antonio Brown. Before the Eagles game this past week, and I apologize for not having the updated stats, but Dak Prescott was 1 for 8 on balls more than 25 yards down the field. That's atrocious. And eventually teams are going to figure out, hey, let's just stop the box. This kid can't throw the ball down the field. We're going to stop the box. We're going to play press man. And our safeties are just going to keep creeping lower and lower and lower and adding guys into the box that the offensive line can't account for. Yes, their offensive line is good, but if they're outnumbered, there's nothing you can do. Eventually, you got to throw the ball down the field.
If I'm Jerry Jones, I go to Tony Romo, and one of my buddies suggested this to me, and I never thought about it till he said it to me, and it makes a whole lot of sense. I go to Tony Romo and I say, Tony, listen, you're an on-the-bubble Hall of Famer. You've led this organization since you've been here, and we've had some great results with not a great team surrounding you. And I say, look, don't play this year. Don't kill yourself, because how many neck injuries has the guy had, right? You can't keep sending him out there if he's one hit away from being paralyzed or having permanent damage, right? He wants to be able to go pull home and play with his kids, right?
So we're going to, sorry, Pete, I don't mean to cut you off, but I got to get into my favorite section of the podcast. Cue up the music. It's time for Pete's Tweets. So Pete, again, live tweeting every morning, Tuesday or Wednesday morning, depending on which day he decides to do it. But it was Wednesday this week. He woke up and tweeted out, the first song on my shuffle, pretty much going to be the best day of 2016. Hashtag Pete's Tweets. If you can guess what the song is correctly, I'll give you $20. If you guessed Backstreet Boys, I Want It That Way, you are correct.
How can you not love the Backstreet Boys?
I love it. I love it.
Great way to start the day.
So Pete continues on his day and says, middle-aged men should not have their hair and beard colored red to cover up the gray. Figure it out, dude. Hashtag Pete's Tweets.
Yeah, so this guy basically had his hair dyed, and it was very noticeable, and he was probably like 50 and had a nice George Costanza haircut going on and a mustache, and it was just awful.
So Pete then tweets out, just put some guy in my back pocket after he tried to cut the Tim's line. Get to the back, moron. Hashtag power move. Hashtag Pete's tweets. Pete, explain.
So I was in the Tim Hortons at 10 Dundas, coming out of the subway, grabbing my morning coffee, and Buddy just walks in and tries to bud the line, and I just basically stepped up to him and said, hey man, get to the back of the line. What do you think this is? And he looked at me, looked at the line, and shuffled back. So I call that putting him in my back pocket because I owned that guy.
Nice. So Pete then gets to the library, gets to do some work, and says, enthusiastic environment in the library this morning. Everyone's up and early, ready to go and attack the day here at RU. Hashtag Pete's tweets. With a picture of the library, and all the cubicles are empty. Pete, what time was that at?
It was at like 9 o'clock in the morning, and there wasn't one person in the library. Like, are you kidding me? I thought this was a school here.
So we're going to go on to, cut the music. We're going to go on to something a little bit more serious. And we talked about this with Stu, but there's a lot of horrible stuff going on in the NFL. And I've just recently, actually, this just happened just this past week. Josh Huff, kick returner for the Eagles, just got pulled over for speeding and a DUI, and they found an unlicensed firearm and marijuana on him. He's since been released by the Eagles. But this is a serious problem, and we're seeing it more and more. But Pete, who's to blame for this? Is it the players? Is it the coaches? Obviously, Stu had his take on this, saying that it's kind of a combination, but ultimately, I believe that this is on the players having to figure it out, but the league is taking a lot of the blow from this. So, Pete, what do you think?
We just talked to Stu about creating a great environment for your athletes to come in and do well on the field and in the classroom, right? We talked to Owen last week, who said playing professionally is a lot harder than trying to manage school and playing baseball, which is something that a lot of people might not have thought of. Now, you take guys from all sorts of walks of life and you put them together and give them millions and millions of dollars, you could have the 6 best people in the world on the planet. But when there's 100 guys in that locker room, are those 6 guys really going to be able to police every single person in there?
No, not at all. And a lot of this comes down to sort of the culture of football, right? All these guys get a lot of money. They want to spend a lot of money, have nice cars, and I always think of a guy like Josh Gordon and Johnny Manziel when they were on the Browns. These are guys who had all the talent in the world and could not, for the life of them, stay out of their own way, which is incredible because Josh Gordon was a phenomenal talent who took his money, partied his ass off, and kind of threw it down the drain for what? And a good time? Could have had a great time if he kept playing in the NFL and been a superstar.
100%. And, I think Manziel's a bit of an animal on his own. But when we're talking about stuff in the media's attention and things like domestic violence with Ray Rice last year, Josh Brown this year, the way the NFL has handled it all has been absolutely atrocious, right? They have not done anything close to rectifying the situation and setting a precedent for their players in their league. So you mean to tell me that Ray Rice beats up his wife and there's a video of it and drags her out of an elevator and he gets a 2-game suspension, but we're going to take Tom Brady to the Supreme Court and give him a 4-game suspension for deflating footballs, quote unquote, when the game was 52-14 or whatever it was?
And you give Le'Veon Bell a 4-game suspension for smoking weed, which, okay, it's a banned substance, it's illegal, but you're giving a 4-game suspension for that and a 2-game suspension for Ray Rice.
And with that too, marijuana is not a banned substance in every professional sports league except for the NFL too, which is, I know, is a hot button issue with a lot of players associations around pro sports. But I'm not making excuses for him, but I'm just saying, like, that compared to Josh Brown beating up his wife and openly documenting it, and then the Giants saying, yeah, like, he's a good guy, blah, blah, blah. And a week later going, yeah, we didn't know about this information. And that's not true. And I don't think it's true. And that's BS, right? You have to know what's going on in your own locker room. And I don't necessarily blame Josh Brown for how poorly the teams handled it. He's not a very good person, clearly, but the team was on fault for that one.
So we're going to end up this podcast with another game we play. We played it last week. This is called Coin Flip. So what we're going to do, the argument here is that the NFL is to blame for the off-the-field problems. And so what we're going to do is we're going to flip a coin, and whoever loses is going to have to argue that this isn't the NFL's fault. This is the players' fault. So, Pete, you got it here? Are you?
Yeah, I just want to throw in again, we both think that this is everybody's fault, but the NFL doesn't have the proper structures in place to help the players be successful on and off the field. So just keep that in mind when we're arguing this. We both agree.
So, Pete, you're going to be heads here. Heads, you have to argue for the players. Tails, I have to argue for the players.
Flip it.
It is heads, so you have to argue for the players. I unfortunately have to defend the NFL right now, argue for the NFL, I guess. So I guess I'm on the side that the NFL is to blame for this.
So I'll go first. We've touched on most of it already, but the players police the locker room, or supposedly police the locker room. Obviously, some better than others. We obviously, every team has different leadership roles and different kind of hierarchy of involvement with the coaching staff and with the veterans and whatnot. But at the end of the day, if the NFL is not going to put proper things into place for these guys to know exactly, hey, if you beat up your wife and there's a video of it, you're suspended for a year, or you're suspended for 2 years, or you're kicked out of the league. Look what happened with Michael Vick. Look what happened with Plaxico Burress when he shot himself in the leg with an unlicensed firearm, right? These are, sure, they're mistakes that the players are making, but the onus has to fall on the NFL to put some guidelines in place and say, hey, idiots, we're going to give you guys some training, and we're going to say, hey, it might seem common sense to you and I, but a lot of these guys come from places and walks of life where their normal isn't necessarily the normal that you and I have growing up in very good, solid, foundational households and structured, societies and whatnot. Some of these guys were living on the streets for some of their lives. They don't know any better than that.
So here's why the NFL is to blame.
All right, so here's the issue, right? The NFL is paying these guys millions upon millions of dollars to come out and put on a good product week in and week out. And for the players, it's like they're paying you, and this is a blessing for you. And we talked about this last week with Owen. It's like, yeah, we're not paying you that much to play baseball, but you're playing baseball, so, right, go play. And it should be the same with the NFL. It's like they are getting paid way more money, a stupid amount of money, to go out and play football. And a lot of these guys are coming out, at college or university at a very young age and just wasting it. And the onus has to fall on the players. Yeah, the NFL could put in a few more things. Look at what the CFL has done. They put in a new policy a few years ago with violence against women, where everybody is responsible. That includes coaches, executives, and suspensions that face up to a lifetime ban. But this comes all the way back to the players. You guys are grown men. Be responsible. Don't break the law, and don't do anything stupid. It's almost common sense. It's ridiculous.
It seems like it's so simple, but you'd be surprised at how certain people think. And unfortunately, the NFL has had more issues than the other leagues. Sorry. So that's about all the time we have for today. Tune in next week. We have Alec's dad, 18-year NHL veteran Dave Reid, joining us. We're going to talk some hockey, and hopefully you learn some things from Stu. Thanks again for coming on the pod, Stu. We'll be back next week. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, share on Facebook, Twitter. My Twitter handle is BigPete44, Pete Apostolopoulos on Twitter. Alex is AlecReid14, Alec Reid on Facebook. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a great one.